Part 76 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 76. John Bellingham, executed for the murder of the Right Honourable Spencer Perceval. Part 3. In the course of 2 days I called again at Bow Street for an answer to this letter, when I received a little memorandum in Mr. Reed's writing, in which he states that he cannot interfere in my affairs, and that he had felt it his duty to communicate the contents of my packet to the Secretary of State. Had he done otherwise, he would have been extremely reprehensible, as events have turned out so calamitously. Events which go to my heart to allude to. Much affected. At last, in reply to a letter of the 18th of April, I received a final and direct answer, which at once convinced me that I had no reason to expect any adjustment whatever of those claims which I had on His Majesty's Government for my criminal detention in Russia. It was in these terms: Whitehall, April 18th, 1812. Sir, I am directed by Mr. Secretary Ryder to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of the 13th instant, requesting to be informed in what stage your claim on His Majesty's Government for criminal detention in Russia now is. In reply, I am to refer you to my several letters of the 18th of February, 9th and 20th of March, by which you have been already informed that your first petition to His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, praying for remuneration, had been referred to the consideration of the Lords of the Council; that upon your second memorial, praying His Royal Highness to give orders that the subject should be brought before Parliament, His Royal Highness had not been pleased to signify any commands; and lastly, in answer to your application to Mr. Ryder, requesting permission on the part of His Majesty's Ministers to present your petition to the House of Commons, you were informed that your application should be addressed to the Right Honourable the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I am, etc., J. Beckett. After this, on personal application at the office of the Secretary of State, and intimating my intention to take the justice in my own hand, I was told, by the mouth of Mr. Hill, that I was at liberty to take such measures as I thought proper. Who then is to be reprobated in this case? Those who were regardless of every feeling of honour and of justice, or him who, spurred on by injury and neglect, and with a due notice of his intentions, pursued the only course likely to lead to a satisfactory termination of calamities which had weighed him down to the lowest ebb of misery? I will now only mention a few observations by way of defence. You have before you all the particulars of this melancholy transaction. Believe me, gentlemen, the rashness of which I have been guilty has not been dictated by any personal animosity to Mr. Perceval, rather than injure whom, from private or malicious motives, I would suffer my limbs to be cut from my body. Here the prisoner seemed again much agitated. If, whenever I am called before the tribunal of God, I can appear with as clear a conscience as I now possess in regard to the alleged charge of the wilful murder of the unfortunate gentleman, the investigation of whose death has occupied your attention, it would be happy for me, as essentially securing to me eternal salvation, but that is impossible. That my arm has been the means of his melancholy and lamented exit, I am ready to allow. But to constitute murder, it must clearly and absolutely be proved to have arisen from malice prepense, and with a malicious design, as I have no doubt the learned judge will shortly lay down, in explaining the law on the subject. If such is the case, I am guilty. If not, I look forward with confidence to your acquittal. That the contrary is the case has been most clearly and irrefutably proved. No doubt can rest upon your minds, as my uniform and undeviating object has been an endeavour to obtain justice according to law for a series of the most long-continued and unmerited sufferings that were ever submitted to a court of law, without having been guilty of any other crime than an appeal for redress for a most flagrant injury offered to my sovereign and my country, wherein my liberty and property have fallen a sacrifice for the continued period of 8 years, to the total ruin of myself and my family, with authenticated documents of the truth of the allegations, merely because it was Mr. Perceval's pleasure that justice should not be granted, sheltering himself with the idea of there being no alternative remaining, as my petition to Parliament for redress could not be brought, as having a pecuniary tendency, without the sanction of his Majesty's ministers, and that he was determined to oppose my claim by trampling both on law and right. Gentlemen, where a man has so strong and serious a criminal case to bring forward as mine has been, the nature of which was purely national, it is the bounden duty of government to attend to it, for justice is a matter of right and not of favour; and when a minister is so unprincipled and presumptuous at any time, but especially in a case of such urgent necessity, to set himself above both the sovereign and the laws, as has been the case with Mr. Perceval, he must do it at his personal risk, for by the law he cannot be protected. Gentlemen, if this is not fact, the mere will of a minister would be law. It would be this thing to day and the other thing to morrow, as either interest or caprice might dictate. What would become of our liberties? Where would be the purity and the impartiality of the justice we so much boast of? To government's non-attendance to the dictates of justice is solely to be attributed to the melancholy catastrophe of the unfortunate gentleman, as any malicious intention to his injury was the most remote from my heart. Justice and justice only was my object, which government uniformly objected to grant, and the distress it reduced me to drove me to despair in consequence, and purely for the purpose of having this singular affair legally investigated, I gave notice at the public office, Bow Street, requesting the magistrates to acquaint his Majesty's ministers that if they persisted in refusing justice, or even to permit me to bring my just petition into Parliament for redress, I should be under the imperious necessity of executing justice myself, solely for the purpose of ascertaining, through a criminal court, whether his Majesty's ministers have the power to refuse justice to a well authenticated and irrefutable act of oppression, committed by the consul and ambassador abroad, whereby my sovereign's and country's honour were materially tarnished, by my person endeavouring to be made the stalking horse of justification to one of the greatest insults that could be offered to the crown. But in order to avoid so reluctant and abhorrent an alternative, I hoped to be allowed to bring my petition to the House of Commons, or that they would do what was right and proper themselves. On my return from Russia, I brought most serious charges to the Privy Council, both against Sir Stephen Shairp and Lord Granville Leveson Gower, when the affair was determined to be purely national, and consequently it was the duty of his Majesty's ministers to arrange it by acting on the resolution of the Council. Suppose, for instance, the charge I brought could have been proved to be erroneous, should not I have been called to a severe account for my conduct? But being true, ought not I to have been redressed? After the notice from the police to government, Mr. Ryder, conscious of the truth and cruelty of the case, transmitted the affair to the Treasury, referring me there for a final result. After a delay of some weeks, the Treasury came to the resolution of sending the affair back to the Secretary of State's office. At the same time I was told by a Mr. Hill that he thought it would be useless by making further application to government, and that I was at liberty to take such measures as I thought proper for redress. Mr. Beckett, the Under Secretary of State, confirmed the same, adding that Mr. Perceval had been consulted, and could not allow my petition to come forward. This direct refusal of justice, with a carte blanche to act in whatever manner I thought proper, were the sole causes of the fatal catastrophe, and they have now to reflect on their own impure conduct for what has happened. It is a melancholy fact that the warping of justice, including all the various ramifications in which it operates, occasions more misery in the world in a moral sense than all the acts of God in a physical one, with which he punishes mankind for their transgressions, a confirmation of which the single but strong instance before you is one remarkable proof. If a poor unfortunate man stops another upon the highway and robs him of but a few shillings, he may be called upon to forfeit his life. But I have been robbed of my liberty for years, ill-treated beyond precedent, torn from my wife and family, bereaved of all my property to make good the consequences of such irregularities, deprived and bereaved of everything that makes life valuable, and then called upon to forfeit it, because Mr. Perceval has been pleased to patronise iniquity that ought to have been punished, for the sake of a vote or two in the House of Commons, with perhaps a similar good turn elsewhere. Is there, gentlemen, any comparison between the enormity of these two offenders? No more than a mite to a mountain. Yet the one is carried to the gallows, while the other stalks in security, fancying himself beyond the reach of law or justice. The most honest man suffers, while the other goes forward in triumph to new and more extended enormities. We have had a recent and striking instance of some unfortunate men who have been called upon to pay their lives as the forfeit of their allegiance in endeavouring to mitigate the rigours of a prison. But, gentlemen, where is the proportion between the crimes for which they suffered and what the government has been guilty of in withholding its protection from me? Even in a Crown case, after the years of sufferings, I have been called upon to sacrifice all my property and the welfare of my family to bolster up the iniquities of the Crown, and then I am prosecuted for my life because I have taken the only possible alternative to bring the affair to a public investigation, for the purpose of being enabled to return to the bosom of my family with some degree of comfort and honour. Every man within the sound of my voice must feel for my situation, but by you, gentlemen of the jury, it must be felt in a peculiar degree, who are husbands and fathers, and can fancy yourselves in my situation. I trust that this serious lesson will operate as a warning to all future ministers, and lead them to do the thing that is right, as an unerring rule of conduct. For if the superior classes were more correct in their proceedings, the extensive ramifications of evil would in a great measure be hemmed up, and a notable proof of the fact is that this court would never have been troubled with the case before it, had their conduct been guided by these principles. I have now occupied the attention of the court for a period much longer than I intended, yet I trust they will consider the awfulness of my situation to be a sufficient ground for trespass, which under other circumstances would be inexcusable. Sooner than suffer what I have suffered for the last 8 years, however, I should consider 500 deaths, if it were possible for human nature to endure them, a fate far more preferable. Lost so long to all the endearments of my family, bereaved of all the blessings of life, and deprived of its greatest sweet, liberty, as the weary traveller, who has long been pelted by the pitiless storm, welcomes the much-desired inn, I shall receive death as the relief of all my sorrows. I shall not occupy your attention longer, but relying on the justice of God, and submitting myself to the dictates of your conscience, I submit to the fiat of my fate, anticipating an acquittal from a charge so abhorrent to every feeling of my soul." Here the prisoner bowed, and his counsel immediately proceeded to call the witnesses for the defence. Anne Billet, who appeared under the strongest impressions of grief, being sworn, deposed that she lived in the county of Southampton. She came to London in consequence of having read in the newspapers of the prisoner having been apprehended for the murder of Mr. Perceval. She was induced to come to town from a conviction that she knew more of him than any other friend. She knew him from a child. He resided latterly in Liverpool, from whence he came at Christmas last. She knew him to be a merchant. His father died insane in Titchfield Street, Oxford Road. She firmly believed that for the last 3 or 4 years the prisoner was in a state of derangement respecting the business which he had been pursuing. She had not seen him for 12 months. Until the present moment she always thought him deranged, when his Russian affairs were the subject of conversation. When cross-examined by Mr. Garrow, she deposed that when in London with the prisoner about 12 months since, he was going to different government offices to seek redress of his grievances. He was then in a state of derangement, as he had been ever since his return from Russia. There was one instance which occurred at the period to which she was alluding, which strongly confirmed her in the opinion of his insanity. About Christmas he told his wife and witness that now he was come from Russia he had realised more than £100,000, with which he intended to buy an estate in the west of England, and to have a house in London. He admitted that he had not got the money, but said it was the same as if he had, for he had gained his cause in Russia, and our government would make good all the loss he had sustained. He repeatedly said to her and to his wife that this was assuredly the fact. Upon one occasion he took Mrs. Bellingham and the witness to the Secretary of State's office, where they saw Mr. Smith, who said if he had not ladies with him he would not have come to him at all. The prisoner told Mr. Smith that the reason why he brought them was to convince them that his claims were just, and that he would very shortly receive the money. Mr. Smith told him he could say nothing upon this subject. He had already sent him a letter alleging that he had nothing to expect. The prisoner then requested Mr. Smith would answer him one question. "My friends say I am out of my senses. Is it your opinion that I am so?" Mr. Smith said it was a very delicate question, and one he did not wish to answer. Having then departed, when they got into the carriage which waited for them, he took hold of his wife's hand and said, "I hope now, my dear, you are convinced all will now end as we wish." Since that period she knew that he had been pursuing his object alone, his wife remaining at Liverpool. Other witnesses were called who deposed to like facts and to their belief in the insanity of the prisoner, but Lord Chief Justice Mansfield having summed up the case, the jury, after a consultation of 2 minutes and a half in the box, expressed a wish to retire, and an officer of the court being sworn, accompanied them to the jury room. As they passed out, the prisoner regarded them separately with a look of mingled confidence and complacency. They were absent 14 minutes, and on their return into court, their countenances, acting as indices to their minds, at once unfolded the determination to which they had come. The prisoner again directed his attention to them in the same manner as before. The names being called over, and the verdict asked for in the usual form, the foreman, in a faltering voice, announced the fatal decision of "Guilty." The prisoner's countenance here indicated surprise, unmixed, however, with any demonstrations of that concern which the awfulness of his situation was calculated to produce. The recorder then passed the awful sentence of death on the prisoner in the most feeling manner, and he was ordered for execution on the following Monday, his body to be anatomized. He received the sentence without any emotions. From the time of his condemnation the unfortunate convict was fed upon bread and water. All means of suicide were removed, and he was not allowed to be shaved, a prohibition which gave him much concern, as he feared he should not appear as a gentleman. He was visited by the Ordinary on Saturday, and some religious gentlemen called on him on Sunday, with whose conversation he seemed greatly pleased. He appeared naturally depressed by his situation, but persisted in a resolute denial of his guilt. He frequently said that he had prepared himself to go to his father, and that he should be pleased when the hour came. Being informed by Mr. Newman that 2 gentlemen from Liverpool had called and left word that his wife and children would be provided for, he seemed but little affected, but having requested pen, ink, and paper, he wrote the following letter to his wife: "My blessed Mary, it rejoiced me beyond measure to hear you are likely to be well provided for. I am sure the public at large will participate in and mitigate your sorrows. I assure you, my love, my sincerest endeavours have ever been directed to your welfare. As we shall not meet any more in this world, I sincerely hope we shall do so in the world to come. My blessings to the boys, with kind remembrance to Miss Stevens, for whom I have the greatest regard, in consequence of her uniform affection for them. With the purest intentions, it has always been my misfortune to be thwarted, misrepresented, and ill-used in life. But however we feel a happy prospect of compensation in a speedy translation to life eternal, it's not possible to be more calm or placid than I feel, and 9 hours more will waft me to those happy shores where bliss is without alloy. Yours ever affectionate, John Bellingham." That the unfortunate man was afflicted with a strange malady which occasionally rendered him incapable of correct conclusions must be evident from the following note, which he wrote the night preceding his execution: "I lost my suit solely through the improper conduct of my attorney and counsel, Mr. Alley, in not bringing my witnesses forward," of whom there were more than 20. "In consequence, the judge took advantage of the circumstance, and I went off on the defence without having brought forward a single friend, otherwise I must inevitably have been acquitted." On the Monday morning, about 6 o'clock, he rose and dressed himself with great composure, and read for half an hour in the prayer book, Dr. Ford then being announced, the prisoner shook him most cordially by the hand, and left his cell for the room allotted for the condemned criminals. He repeated the declaration which he had frequently before made, that his mind was perfectly calm and composed, and that he was fully prepared to meet his fate with resignation. After a few minutes spent in prayer, the sacrament was administered to him, and during the whole of the ceremony he seemed to be deeply impressed with the truths of the Christian religion, and repeatedly uttered some pious ejaculations. After the religious ceremony was ended, the prisoner was informed that the sheriffs were ready. He answered in a firm tone of voice, "I am perfectly ready also." The executioner then proceeded to fasten his wrists together, and the prisoner turned up the sleeves of his coat and clasped his hands together, presenting them to the man who held the cord, and said, "So." When they were fastened, he desired his attendants to pull down his sleeves so as to cover the cord. The officer then proceeded to secure his arms behind him, and when the man had finished, he moved his hands upwards, as if to ascertain whether he could reach his neck, and asked whether they thought his arms were sufficiently fastened, saying that he might struggle, and that he wished to be so secured as to prevent any inconvenience arising from it. He was answered that the cord was quite secure, but he requested that it might be tightened a little, which was accordingly done. During the whole of the awful scene he appeared perfectly composed and collected. His voice never faltered, but just before he left the room to proceed to the place of execution, he stooped down his head, and appeared to wipe away a tear. He was then conducted by the Lord Mayor, sheriffs, under-sheriffs, and officers, Dr. Ford walking with him, from the room, in which he had remained from the time his irons were taken off, through the press yard and the prison to the fatal spot, before the debtor's door at Newgate. He ascended the scaffold with rather a light step, a cheerful countenance, and a confident, a calm, but not an exulting air. He looked about him a little, lightly and rapidly, which seems to have been his usual manner and gesture, but made no remark. Before the cap was put over his face, Dr. Ford asked if he had any last communication to make, or anything particular to say. He was again proceeding to talk about Russia and his family, when Dr. Ford stopped him, calling his attention to the eternity into which he was entering, and praying. Bellingham prayed also. The clergyman then asked him how he felt, and he answered calmly and collectedly that he thanked God for having enabled him to meet his fate with so much fortitude and resignation. When the executioner proceeded to put the cap over his face, Bellingham objected to it, and expressed a strong wish that the business could be done without it, but Dr. Ford said that was not to be dispensed with. While the cap was being fastened on, it being tied round the lower part of the face by the prisoner's neckerchief, and just when he was tied up, about a score of persons in the mob set up a loud and reiterated cry of "God bless you! God save you!" This cry lasted while the cap was fastening on, and though those who raised it were loud and daring, it was joined in by but very few. The Ordinary asked Bellingham if he heard what the mob was saying. He said he heard them crying out something, but he did not understand what it was, and inquired what. The cry having by this time ceased, the clergyman did not inform him what it was. The fastening on of the cap being accomplished, the executioner retired, and a perfect silence ensued. Dr. Ford continued praying for about a minute, while the executioner went below the scaffold, and preparations were made to strike away its supporters. The clock struck 8, and while it was striking the 7th time, the clergyman and Bellingham both fervently praying, the supporters of the internal part of the scaffold were struck away, and Bellingham dropped out of sight down as far as the knees, his body being in full view, and the clergyman was left standing on the outer frame of the scaffold. When Bellingham sunk, the most perfect and awful silence prevailed. Not even the slightest attempt at a huzzah or noise of any kind whatever was made. The body was afterwards carried in a cart, followed by a crowd of the lower class, to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and privately dissected. The greatest precautions were adopted to prevent accidents among the crowd. A large bill was placarded in all the avenues to the Old Bailey, and carried about on a pole, to this effect: "Beware of entering the crowd. Remember 30 poor creatures were pressed to death by the crowd when Haggerty and Holloway were executed," and no accident of any moment occurred. To prevent any disposition of tumult, a military force was stationed near Islington, and to the south of Blackfriars Bridge, and all the volunteer corps of the metropolis received instructions to be under arms during the whole of the day. Part 76.